From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, and this week we have Congressman Kevin Hern from Oklahoma, who also is chair of the House Republican Policy Committee and a member of the House Ways and Means Committee. Welcome, Congressman. Who were you rooting for in the Super Bowl? Did you have a good Sunday or a bad Sunday?
It was a bad Sunday.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had a good Sunday, so we won't let that get in the way of our conversation, though. We are really thrilled to have you here because we want to spend this episode talking about the business of the House, the to-do list. A lot of the attention so far has been on Donald Trump and his executive actions, nominations and confirmations in the Senate. But the reality is that an enormous aspect of Donald Trump's agenda is going to stand or fall in the House of Representatives, which also happens to have a historically small margin. The majority does. And so this is going to be a big moment here. And obviously what everyone's talking about at the moment is budget reconciliation. I know that there was a thought that last week there might be a markup. That didn't happen. There was a big meeting in the White House. Now you're back and talking about new numbers yet again. Where do things stand?
Well, we just got noticed a few minutes ago that the Budget Committee will be meeting on Thursday to do a markup. So we're moving forward on the House side. As I'm sure well aware, the budget resolution language is what unlocks the ability to have reconciliation. And all reconciliation really is, it's a Senate maneuver to break the filibuster rules so you can have a simple majority on the Senate side. So that means you can do everything with Republican votes. The Democrats will not really have a chance to, they will demonize us in the press. And that's what they should be doing if that's the minority party. But the reality is the Democrats will not have a voice in this, and we'll push to have President Trump's policies extended, his tax policies extended. He wants them to be made permanent. We're going to be looking at how we can do that, and also, secure our southern border, making sure our military men and women have the things they need to compete and to protect us around the world.
Well, thank you for explaining that. It saved me from having to do it, and that was a good explanation. And of course, obviously, I don't think Democrats have much of a leg to stand on. They, of course, used reconciliation during Joe Biden's time in office and used it to push through that massive spending bill they had in 2021 when they first took over. Your bill, as you just mentioned, is going to be much more focused on extending the tax cuts from 2017, also the president's priorities on the border, maybe some defense dollars. What kind of numbers are we looking at here? Has that actually been finalized? Because again, that seemed to have been the broad disagreement. As you note, this essentially, if you have a markup, it sends instructions to committee, but you have to have those top line numbers. How big are those tax cuts going to be? How much is the bill going to cost per se? And how much is Republicans going to attempt to try to get in savings as well, spending cuts?
Well, as you know, it's a combination of spending cuts and the growth in the economy that will pay for it over a 10-year period. With the permanency of the tax policy and putting it into current policy or baseline policy, which is what the Senate wants to do and move it forward, the pay for is more important because what it does, it actually goes to pay down existing deficits and therefore getting to, finding a cost neutral position so you can actually start paying down the debt. The reality is that if the tax code is allowed to expire at the end of this year, that some 207 million Americans will feel a tax increase under Republican majority, which it just simply cannot happen. It shouldn't happen under a Democrat majority. As we're finding out with DOGE and with President Trump, the federal government has literally hundreds of billions of dollars of waste. And the last thing we want to do is to take back, some $500 billion a year from the American taxpayers and putting it back into a system where there's so much waste, fraud, and abuse. And so that's what's before us here. We have to get the tax codes extended for all Americans. And really what's driving the Democrats crazy, as you just alluded to, is when you see this latest CBS poll that comes out that say 70% of Americans love what President Trump is doing with his energy, his persistent going out to protect America. And that's what President Trump's going to do. He made a pledge to protect the men and women of America, the families of America, both from a national security standpoint and a financial security. And he's going to do that.
Yeah, but so the reason that this hasn't happened so far in the House is because it hasn't been able to agree on those numbers. If we've got a budget markup coming on Thursday, does that mean there is an agreement or the outlines, contours of one?
That's what it means, and that there might be some final tweaks that the president needs to sign off on as well, because at the end of the day, the House and Senate will be working in lockstep with the president. So we're not moving like in hundreds of yards ahead of one another. We're all working on a daily basis to make sure that we're together. Last Thursday, we were at the White House for 5 hours with the president and his team. And then later that evening, we're in Speaker Johnson's office, and we had, senators on conference calls at the same time. So we're having the House, the Senate, and the White House work together in lockstep to move forward. There were a couple extra things that the Speaker and the Chairman of the Budget Committee wanted to make sure that the president was aware of before they put out those final numbers, but you'll see those very soon.
So it sounds as though you might have numbers, but you're just not going to tell me. Does that sound right?
That sounds very close. You've been doing this a long time.
Okay. All right. Okay. I gave it my best. Okay. Look, if this doesn't happen, because again, the House has been saying it's going to do this for a couple of weeks, and there has been progress. And one result of that is that the Senate moved this week its own budget committee under Senator Lindsey Graham forward with what it called a two-bill approach. So it wants to do two reconciliation bills for this year, one for the last fiscal year and one for the upcoming fiscal year. There's been a lot of pushback in the House on that. The argument in the Senate is, let's put some of the president's biggest priorities into this first bill, get it done on the border, some defense spending, have some spending cuts as well to cover that, and do that and save this really thorny, complicated question about tax policy for later in the year, give our caucuses more time to work through that. The House is very much not wanted to go down that road. Why not make the argument here for why that's not maybe a more efficient approach?
Yeah, so when you look at the tax bill itself, extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act policies forward, it's not the argument about the policies themselves that Republicans are concerned about. It's how do you pay for them? And many of the pay-fors that will be used up in the first reconciliation bill to fund the border and the military, some $325 to $350 billion, would be the same offsets that we'd need for the tax policy extension or permanency. And the reason that's important is that my guess is if we got the first reconciliation bill, the so-called small bill, it would move very quickly. It would be done and we'd have the funding done. And then we would have the protracted arguments about how to fund all of the tax bills without the funding that we just used on the border and the military. Sounds complicated, I know. But the reality is that when you have a Congress that has a smaller majority than the Senate for the first time and maybe the entire time we've been in a country, you have to get 218 votes. You can't lose a single vote as a Speaker of the House. And think about how difficult that is. It's almost impossible. It seems like an impossible task. And so I think the Speaker's doing a fantastic job. It's not like the old days back in 2017, even when there were 22 vote margin, you could just say, we're going to put it on the floor. And if you just have such a heartburn, you can't support it, that's okay. I don't really need your vote. You can't say that now. You have to have every single vote. Every Republican wants the tax policies to move forward. They don't want to raise taxes on American people, but you only get this opportunity to have the trifecta every 7 to 10 years. And as Republicans, we were fortunate to have it 7 years ago for the bill, but we have to cut mandatory spending. It's the only time you can cut mandatory spending or the waste associated with it. And that's what's happening right now. And so we're trying to get this, make sure the president will sign off on it, and then we can move forward this week.
So I understand that argument about needing a lot of leverage. Here's the bit I don't understand, but I want you to explain it to me. Is I see the point of wanting all of the tools you can have to get the Republican caucus unanimously in the House on board with a big bill. But what I don't get is, are you really saying that if you broke out some of these pieces in the beginning, that then you're left with the threat of raising taxes on millions of Americans, $4.7 trillion worth of tax increases on Americans if the Republican House doesn't act prior to the end of the year? And you don't think that is enough to get all the Republicans on board with passing a second reconciliation bill?
Well, I would like to think it is. I asked that question seems almost like daily to those who won't prioritize extending the tax package. But also, every member in the Republican Party understands that threat of expiration of the code and the raising of taxes also takes away their lever to get the president to cut more spending. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to get everything that we can in one big, beautiful bill, to use the president's words, get the border, get the military, get the tax package done, move it quickly, very quickly, and then use the second reconciliation bill, as you alluded to earlier, to codify some of the things that we need to do that President Trump and Elon Musk have found. Because otherwise, all of this will just go back to where it was potentially with the next president. And so if we found, $1 billion a day or whatever the number is that's being reported, whatever we can codify in a reconciliation package, we should do so and not waste these to split up something that should be done together.
How big of a complication is it? And whether you like these policies or you don't like these policies, I'm speaking broadly here to listeners, but how big of a complication is it, all of these additional tax promises that President Trump made while out on the campaign trail? We were already looking at $4.7 trillion simply to extend existing tax reform. And now you have these other provisions, for instance, no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes Social Security. I mean, by my back of the envelope scribbling, that's at least another $1 trillion, maybe?
That's pretty close. We can't do anything with Social Security in a reconciliation package. It's forbidden by the parliamentarian from happening. So you're really down to, other various things. The president hasn't, specified they have to be done in the first deal. This particular reconciliation package is something you could do in a second one. Just he's promised this on the campaign trail, and it's the aggregation of all of his promises that got him the mandate of winning the electoral vote and the popular vote. Something has been done by a Republican in years. And so he feels an obligation, and I can certainly understand it. He feels an obligation to those who supported him, as anybody that's been elected does. If you go out and tell people something, you make a promise, you want to keep your promise. And that's what he's doing. He talked about rooting out waste and fraud and abuse. He's doing that. He talked about pushing for no tax on tips. He's doing that. And the list that you just described, he's doing that. And he talked about securing the border, and he's doing that. There's not anything that he said on the campaign trail that he has not moved forward doing it, including the reciprocating tariffs that are out there. That's why he has such a high approval rating, even by many Democrats, because at 70%, you're reaching into the Democrat and independence roles too. So I think it's important. I think it's important that we as the Republican Congress support him and do everything we can to make sure we codify the things he's talking about, because the fact of the matter is, had he not get elected, none of us would be talking about this today anyway.
Well, there's that. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more with Congressman Kevin Hern. Welcome back. I am here with Kevin Hern, the chair of the House Republican Policy Committee. Another thing that you guys have going on is last year, at the end of the year, Congress kicked funding for the remaining fiscal year into this year. The deadline for that running out, where something needs to be done to finish out this fiscal year, is the middle of March. Where do things stand on that? Where do you see things going on last year's appropriations bills?
Well, first, let me say this. The president and the vice president were correct in saying that we should have cleaned up the mess under President Biden and not extended President Biden's mess into President Trump's first 100 days in office. I agreed with them. I would have been supportive of that. That did not happen. So here we are. We've got an imminent threat of government shutdown. And we've got a debt ceiling problem. We've got an issue with major catastrophic event out in Southern California. All these things have to be dealt with. And they can't be dealt with until we get a top line appropriated number. And right now, because of something that happened 2 years ago under then Speaker McCarthy and a negotiated position with the Democrats in the Senate and the House, we came up with a bill that doesn't match what's in law. And so whether it's, these side deals that you once read about, some $60 billion in side deals, we don't want to move those forward because they're not in the law. And I know that my friend and colleague from Oklahoma, Chairman Tom Cole, the appropriations chair, is working feverishly to try to figure out with his House counterpart and Rosa DeLauro and the Senate counterparts how he gets that done. Because until you do that, you can't even finish up 2025 with the appropriations to get even an omnibus. And then we need to get on to 2026. So we have this other show going on, if you will, from budget resolution, reconciliation package, and then we have the most imminent threat, which is the funding of the government. And you may have read today where the Democrats are toying with, should they force a shutdown to prove a point? So a lot of gamesmanship going on. I know the American people, it's a challenge to understand everything that's going on, but these are like really, really intense times and negotiations. And here's the real thing that people need to understand. The difference right now that's going on is President Trump and the Republicans are trying to figure out how to cut the size of government, get rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse, and make sure that their taxes stay low into the future. The Democrats are trying to prevent President Trump from finding where the waste, fraud, and abuse is at. And they want to make sure that the spending stays at a high level and that as many policies from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris can stay in place so that they can hope that in 4 years they can take back over and continue the onslaught of spending that Joe Biden had in his presidency. And that's the real fight that's going on. That's what everybody needs to know across America.
I want to talk about the Democrats in just a second, but one more thing on this funding fight for last year's appropriations, government funding. One of the reasons that this got kicked into the new year is that there was a sizable amount of Republicans, and by the way, I hear them, I feel them, that were like, no more omnibuses. And, as someone who's had to write about these horrific omnibuses over the years where everything gets stuffed into some year-end bill, I get it. And the thought was that if you give some more time, maybe you could still have regular appropriations bills, not a big omnibus. Are we nonetheless headed toward another omnibus, as it were? And is there ever any hope that Congress is going to have regular order on appropriations bills again?
Well, let me start with the last thing first. It's something I've been arguing about since I've been in Congress for 6 years, being in business for 40 years. I've never seen a business or a family or a city or a state or a county that could operate without doing a budget every single year. Only in the federal government can you not have a budget. As a Republican Study Committee chair, I did the budget for 2 years, and then as a chairman, had the budget for 2 years. So 4 consecutive years of budgets that I've got my signature on. So I'm out there where I'm at, and I've seen the enormity of the problem. It starts with a budgeting process, authorizing committees doing their work, and then the appropriators doing their work to make sure that the agencies are funded. I know that Chairman Cole wants that to happen as well. That's why he's incredibly frustrated that we can't get a top line so he can finish up 2025. And it's either going to be a continuing resolution at current funding levels, which is problematic for some Republicans because that means you'd be funding USAID at that same level and FEMA and others, or you do an omnibus and you clean some of it up. But when you open it up, to your point, then everything gets dumped into it. So that's the other side show, if you will, that's going on that is intensely being debated with the appropriators and the leadership as well. So a lot of things going on in Congress right now, a lot.
Yeah, let me ask about the Democrats and that, because obviously the other complication of this is that unlike reconciliation, when it comes to this government funding bill, you do need 60 votes in the Senate. So you're going to need some Senate cooperation here. And right now, it sounds as though Democrats are essentially trying to take all of Donald Trump's agenda hostage to this, saying, we're not going to give you any help keeping the government open unless you scale back everything else he's doing. I am assuming Republicans are not going to fall prey to that, but is the alternative a shutdown if they won't help?
Well, I think the alternative will probably be some length of a CR, even in spite of the FEMA conversation. And this is a perspective. To your point, with Omni, you're going to have this. With a CR, you're going to have to figure out, because to your point, you're going to have some help on the Senate side with Democrats. The issue the Democrats have is they have been able to, over the years, to avoid a shutdown being their problem or being blamed for them. This would be clearly a positioning and a posturing that the Democrats be one shutting down the government. I think the longer this whole idea and this work of DOGE goes along, the more things are going to be exposed. And I think the sway of public opinion will be in President Trump's favor, because even if you look at Secretary Rubio and pulling the appropriate funding of USAID and some things around the world, pulling it back into state and housing it where it can have overwatch is important. But the funding and the waste as it comes out as it exposed, the American people aren't going to tolerate this going forward. So I think every day that goes forward and they're doing that work, some of the work that you're going to see that comes out of CMS and DOGE and what they're finding there out of Social Security and what you're seeing there is really going to frustrate the American people. And it's going to make it harder for Democrats to try to shut him down because it's going to look like they've been hiding the corruption in government that every American suspects that there is. So I think time is not on the favor of Democrats.
There is no question that I think it's one thing that unites Americans is I think whether or not you're an American who believes more in the mission of government or less in the mission of government, more in freedom, commerce, regardless, people do seem to agree that the government does not work well. It is not efficient. And I would argue that those who stand in the way of trying to make it more efficient are not going to earn many political points. We're going to take one more break. When we come back, more about the House of Representatives' big tasks coming up.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome back. I'm here with Kevin Hern, Congressman from Oklahoma. One last bucket of items at the House is obviously legislation, things to change policy. You guys in the House, you successfully passed the Laken-Riley Act, International Criminal Court sanctions. What else might be coming down the road there?
Well, I think anything to do with the border is going to be something that's going to be supported. Again, I think when you see with government overreach, these are going to be issues that Democrats, enough to pass a bill, are going to have a hard time voting against. Corruption, the border, national security for all Americans, strengthen our men and women in uniform. Those are still going to be very difficult for the Democrats to vote against. You have 13 Democrats in districts that President Trump won, and we're coming up on a midterm where historically the party of the White House loses the midterm, and President Trump is committed to helping Republicans stay in. Some would argue that's selfish, but hey, he knows if he gets us to win the midterms and he gets 4 years of his legislative agenda, I believe we'll keep the Senate, in 26. So that gives President Trump 4 years to meet his commitments to the American people. Otherwise, this all comes to a screeching halt come early next year as people get into the throes of their re-elections. And so we appreciate everybody working together. We just need to get this reconciliation bill done and move on to the greater work that we need to do in codifying the efficiencies in government that we're seeing being exposed right now.
Yeah, that prioritization makes a lot of sense. Last question, just it's a little bit of a narrowing in on subjects, but it happens to be a subject that's very dear to my heart and I know is also dear to your heart, and that is school choice. I saw that you recently introduced legislation that would expand the uses of 529s and allow K through 12 families to use these accounts for educational expenses. Talk about that, but also more broadly, school choice as a federal issue. Obviously, education is a bit more of a state purview, but I'd really love to hear where you think the federal government can play a role as we see that expanding amazingly out in the states. What's the federal government's role in all of that?
Yeah, I think that's what's come into question certainly since 1980 and the establishment of the Department of Education under Jimmy Carter. And, President Reagan tried to end it in his first year and was not successful, even in its infancy. And now it's $100 billion plus agency, not a lot of employees, but controls a lot of money. And it's problematic because when you talk to teachers away from their union representatives, like back in Oklahoma, where we have a strong parent choice opportunity in Oklahoma through many tax credits and other things where the money follows the child instead of staying in the area. I think when you talk to the teachers and the board members that love their teachers, as I do, I think teachers, there's such impact on young people today and throughout our lives, right? I think when you talk to them, they'll understand. They say, we don't like the restraints that's put on us by the federal government because it creates disparity. It creates things that we shouldn't have to deal with at the school level, but we have to do it because that's where the money's at. And as a person, myself and my wife grew up in public schools in Arkansas and the Ozark Mountains and never thought about going to private schools. We went to public schools because you paid taxes to go to public school.
Right.
And now here we are today, whether it's rural Oklahoma or urban Oklahoma, parents should have the opportunity to make sure and redirect their funds so that children can get the best education possible. Some of the most impoverished places in our urban areas across America make it really difficult for kids to get the proper education. And so I'm huge on this. I think teachers do their very best that they can with what they've been given. But if we can get kids who want to learn in classrooms, it makes the entire environment for children a much more robust learning experience. And that's what it's really about. We're having abysmal rankings around the world in our education system, and we're getting crushed by those developing nations that have better education systems. We have to correct this, and we have to correct it now.
You are absolutely right. I can't think of a higher priority. Congressman, thank you for your time, for your insight and explaining where things stand in the House right now. We also want to thank our listeners. We are here every week. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button. And if you want to write to us, you can at pwpodcast@wsj.com.